spoken about in the Quran, in, you know, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us in Surah An-Nisa, he says that if you anticipate a split between them, meaning a husband and a wife, appoint a mediator from his family and another from hers. And if they desire reconciliation, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will restore harmony between them. And surely Allah is all knowing, all aware. Right. So here Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is talking about, and this is major conflict, right? Where this is to the point where two people are thinking about splitting. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is addressing that. And so naturally, there's going to be a lot more even minor conflicts that can arise in marriage as well. And so it's not about whether conflict exists in a relationship. It's about how you choose to approach the conflict. And this is applicable to marriage, but it's also applicable to any relationship that we have in our lives, with our children, with our friends, with our other family members, with our parents. How we approach conflict in a relationship is what really and truly makes the difference. And it can actually conflict can actually end up bringing you closer to another person, because it can serve as an opportunity to connect with one another and to understand what the other person needs. A lot of times conflict arises because of an unmet need. Something's happening and this person is having some need that they have that's being unfulfilled. And so conflict is a way to bring that out and to discuss it. So we don't need to be afraid of conflict. It's, you know, knowing that it's inevitable is important, but also knowing that having like fights and combat, that's optional. That's not necessarily a part of conflict unless we choose it to be. And I think this is a really important topic, not just because it's Domestic Violence Awareness Month, but generally, but especially because of the COVID situation and being in quarantine and things in our lives being very, very different on a lot of fronts. A lot of the changes that come up now are naturally going to lead to increased stress, which is naturally going to lead to increased conflict in a lot of the relationships in our lives, especially in marriage, right? And so recognizing that things are stressful, that things are different, that things are hard, right, is really important in order to have mercy on yourself and have mercy on your spouse as well, right? Because the kinder that you are to yourself, the less that you expect perfection from yourself, the kinder you can be to others around you, and the less you're going to expect perfection from others as well. So this is definitely not the time to expect perfection. Now is the time to really shift our mentality to assume that the people in our life are doing the best that they can, right? Not the best that they want to do, but the best that they can, because it makes our lives much better if we choose to think that the person sitting across from me, the person I'm spending my life with, right? The person I'm raising my children with, it makes my life much better if I choose to think that that person is doing the best that they can, because it helps you to let go of resentment rather than holding on to that and exhausting yourself by holding on to that. And it allows you to make space for kindness and empathy and understanding, as well as an assumption of positive intent. And that's called husn al-dhan, right? Like where you are assuming that what your spouse is doing is coming from a place of goodwill, of good intent, right? And the Prophet ﷺ told us to beware of suspicion, because suspicion is the worst of false tales, and don't look for others' faults, right? So he says this hadith, and it is such profound advice, because that mental shift is going to provide a lot more tranquility in marriage. Because what you notice about the way that we work as human beings is we find what we're looking for. If you're looking for good, you will find it, right? If you're looking for good in your day, you will find it. If you're looking for negatives, you will find that too. So if you're looking for good in your spouse, you're going to find that good. If you're looking for negatives, you're also going to find that. You know, so a lot of it really depends on what we're searching for and what we think we're going to find as well, right? And so having that ability to ascribe positive intent to your spouse is a really important factor. But then also intentionality. having, as we go through this talk, having the intention to remind ourselves that we turn all of this back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. In our dynamics with others, the less we focus on them and the more we focus on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and our relationship with him, the happier we tend to be, right? Because it's particularly helpful, especially when in the midst of conflict. If you are treating somebody nicely only for their sake, then if you're not feeling nice feelings toward them, you're going to stop treating them nicely. But if you're treating somebody nicely for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then no matter how you're feeling toward that person, again, not in the case of an abusive relationship or something like that, right? But in a normal relationship, if you're doing it for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then what that person is doing, what that person is saying, right? How your feelings shift are very ideally, not going to change your reactions and your actions so much because your intention is in a higher place, right? And the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu one of my favorite hadiths is, he asked his companions, he said, "Shall I not inform you of something more excellent in degree than fasting, prayer, and sadaqah, giving charity?" And so the people replied, "Yeah, yes, O Prophet, of course they wanted to know what could be better than fasting, prayer, charity. I mean, these are 3 pillars of Islam, right?" And so he responded, "It's putting things right between people. Putting things right between people." So if you go into this with the intention, you go into a conflict with your spouse, you go into a day with your spouse, right? With the intention that you're striving to put things right between you and your spouse, right? Then that intention and that action that's going to then come from that is better than fasting, prayer, and charity. SubhanAllah. Right. And so, it's really an amazing thing if you transform your thought process and you try to do it for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So now let's talk a little bit about the types of conflict that tend to naturally arise in marriage, and the reasons why they arise. So one of the main reasons why conflict tends to come up is in dealing with a lot of clients over the past 10 years, one of the things that I've really noticed is a lack of self-awareness results in very, very big emotional reactions. And what do I mean by that? I mean that if you don't know yourself, right? And if you don't know where the problems truly lie, like what truly upsets you, what truly bothers you, not the little thing like, your husband leaves the socks on the floor or your wife left dishes in the sink or whatever it is, not that, right? These are small things, but underneath that, why is that such a big deal? If you don't know that, then you can't address it and it can't be fixed, right? And so having a limited sense of self-awareness can really be detrimental. So getting to know yourself is a very important component in a healthy relationship. So number one, you want to understand your triggers. You want to understand, okay, when this happens or somebody says this, I notice that I have a very big emotional reaction, right? And I need to get to the bottom of where that's coming from, right? Why does this huge emotional reaction tend to come up, right? And so once you understand, okay, in this situation, this tends to be a trigger. This tends to result in a very big emotional reaction. Then you can ask yourself, okay, typically a big emotional reaction tells me that there's something underneath the surface, which means that, okay, what is really going on for me, right? So if, your husband leaves the socks on the floor, right? Or, if your husband locks himself in the office while you're dealing with the everyday stressors of the house and kids during quarantine, right? Why does that evoke such a strong emotional reaction? Typically, it's because there is an unfulfilled need. There is a need that is coming up underneath the surface, right? And so if you don't know what that need is, then you can't get it addressed, right? And so when you figure out, okay, why am I reacting this way? And you realize, okay, maybe I have a need. Is it that I feel unsupported, right? Is it that I feel lonely, that I'm doing this all on my own? Is it that I feel overwhelmed? Is it that I feel resentment or jealousy that he can be alone in his office and I can't get away from the kids, right? Do I feel unvalued? Do I feel invisible? Do I feel unappreciated, right? All of these different things tell you that there's something missing that needs to be filled, right? So it's not just about the fact that the door is closed and you're dealing with the kids on your own. It's about what is happening underneath the surface that results in such a big emotional reaction. What's the need that needs to be fulfilled, right? So understanding your triggers, understanding what the need is, and then also understanding how to self-regulate. This is really, really important, right? Like, how do we, when we're dealing with an uncomfortable situation, a difficult situation, how do we not blow up? That's what being able to self-regulate means, right? And so understanding what works for you in different situations, understanding what's going to help you when you're feeling these big emotions come up is really important to managing a healthy relationship, right? So it can be anything. So, having something that you would do before you share your concern with your spouse, right? Or before you start yelling, right? How you can calm yourself down, right? In a way that feels best. This can be anything from, reciting a few ayat, right? The Prophet ﷺ encourages us to say, A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim, right? When we start getting upset. Making wudu is another sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ when you're feeling upset. And it's actually a very, even research proven technique, because it's a grounding technique, which means that, when you're feeling overwhelmed mentally and emotionally, then do something physical to focus in on the present moment. So focus when you're making wudu, focus on the feel of the water in your hands, on your face, right? And bringing yourself back into the moment can be very, very calming. It can be deep breathing. It can be reminding yourself that your efforts are being seen by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, whatever works for you in order to self-regulate, right? But this requires a degree of self-awareness, right? And so when we're more self-aware, our conflicts can be much more productive. The other thing that tends to get in the way and can exacerbate conflicts in marriage is the typical communication issues. If there's one thing that tends to constantly come up in marriage counseling, it's communication issues, misunderstandings that result because of not understanding what the other person is trying to say while thinking that you get it, right? Not understanding the circumstances that they're coming from, their underlying concerns, not realizing that, one of the things that's most interesting and also most difficult about marriage counseling is the fact that whenever two people enter the room, you're not just helping them manage their relationship, but they're bringing in all of their past experiences, all of their past relationships from within their own families, from, all of their past experiences that have impacted them and the way they're going to see their spouse. All of that comes into the mix and comes into the room. And that comes up in every single conflict between spouses too, right? Everybody has a different history. They came from different homes. They came from different experiences. And so the stories that come up during conflict and during difficult circumstances are going to be different from one another. And so all of that comes up in communication, right? And so, some of the ways to deal with that, this is advice from John and Julie Gottman, who are very, very well known in the field of marriage counseling and marriage research, is, there's an acronym for it, which is ATTUNE, ATTUNE. A is awareness, right? Like, to try and get a greater understanding of what your spouse is trying to say, increase your awareness, right? Pay attention to what, what is going on in the context, right? Is this something that's come up before? Turning toward the person. So don't ignore it, right? If your spouse is upset, turn physically, right? And then also verbally toward the person, nod, show that you're listening, right? Tolerance, patience, right? That's being patient with trying to understand what they're saying, being patient if they're feeling emotional, understanding, really trying to see if you can get what they're saying. And some of the best ways to do that is, if I understand this correctly, what you're trying to say is this. That's, it's called reflective listening, where you basically repeat back what you heard, because a lot of times, and it sounds silly, right? But you would be amazed to see what you mishear. You know, a lot of times like, well, of course I heard it. I was sitting right here, but you heard it in your own way. It's very different than hearing it in the way that it was intended. And so making sure that you have a full understanding of what your spouse is intending to say is really important. Non-defensive listening. When your spouse is sharing a concern, especially about you, it's really easy to get defensive. Nobody wants to hear criticism, right? But trying to not get defensive so that this can be solved is really important, right? Because the goal isn't to win, right? You're not on two separate teams pitted against each other. The goal is to maintain your marriage and the health of your marriage. And so if one person is winning an argument, then the relationship is failing, and it's not a win in reality, right? The goal isn't to win. You guys are in it together. And then the final one is empathy. That's very, very powerful, right? Because if somebody is sharing a concern and then you immediately come in with, but really it's not a big deal. Like, I don't understand why the dishes in the sink are a big deal. The socks on the floor are a big deal. What's so hard about just putting it in the dishwasher or putting it in the hamper? Like, it's not a big deal. That is one sure way to amplify the conflict, right? But if you say something like, okay, well, I can understand that it kind of makes you feel like you're alone in doing everything in the house if you find that, I can't even put my socks in the hamper. And so, I get why that's a big deal for you. That empathy is going to immediately start to tone down the conflict and prevent it from becoming a really overblown argument. Right. And so this all helps to get a greater understanding of what your spouse is going through. The other thing that's really important with communication, particularly in during conflict, is repairing, right? Like having the ability to repair during the conflict. And this can be in any way, right? And so it's interesting because there's a hadith of the Prophet ﷺ where he says, I guarantee a house on the outskirts of paradise for the one who leaves an argument, even if he's right. And repairing is a way to do that, right? You're taking a step out of the conflict of the argument. And you're saying things like, okay, I think your concerns make sense. Or, can I rephrase that? Or if I'm hearing you correctly, I'm sorry for this. So you're trying to repair things. I'm going to just wrap up my points really quickly because I know that Sister Madiha needs her time as well, inshallah. The other point that I want to mention is that a lot of times the conflict is exacerbated when people shift blame. And the way to solve that is take responsibility for the role that you are contributing to the struggle, right? And so, if there are issues that are happening at home, like your spouse is spending a lot of time out of the house and it's really making you angry, you address the need and everything, but you also ask yourself, well, how am I contributing to this, right? Am I, as soon as my spouse comes home, am I, like immediately complaining about the fact that he wasn't home before, right? Saying something sarcastic like, oh, how nice of you to finally join us, and is that encouraging me to get my needs met? Is that allowing that to happen? Also, the understanding that the way that your needs, the way you want your needs addressed can be very different from the way you want your spouse wants their needs addressed. So for example, everybody experiences love, respect, care in different ways. So understanding what your spouse needs in order to feel loved is really, really important. Rather than assuming. So for example, you might be a person who, in order to feel loved, gift giving is very important to you. When your spouse brings you a gift, that really makes you feel loved. And your spouse may be somebody who, if you help with the dishes, that is a way of feeling loved. And so if you're giving gifts because that's your way of feeling loved, or it's called love language, if that's your love language, it might not work for your spouse. And so understanding what they need is particularly important. And so I'm just going to end with one final point, inshallah, which is the idea of how we sometimes minimize the good and we magnify the bad, right? And so this comes down to the idea of gratitude, right? And our brains fall into the trap of looking for these negatives. right? And so instead, looking for what your spouse is doing well, magnifying what they do well so that they feel loved and they feel affirmed, and it encourages them to do more, right? Like Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us, لَإِن شَكَرْتُمْ لَأَزِيدَنَّكُمْ, right? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he's promising us here that if you are grateful, then I will certainly give you more. So if we're grateful for the what our spouse is doing right, one of the most amazing manifestations of this ayah is that the more you choose to see your blessings, the more blessings you eventually begin to see. You're training your brain to focus on what you have rather than what you lack, right? And so in doing that, you also allow yourself to, focus on the changes you want to make in yourself. And one of the most important ones in that is prioritizing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. One of the things that, research has found is that in marriages, there's a correlation between people who reported reading Quran daily reported improvements in their marriage during social isolation, like during this COVID period. And then also that people who have a close connection with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, they found that there was a positive correlation with marital satisfaction as well. And so finding things that make you feel connected to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that allow you to prioritize Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, can be very, very meaningful in also improving and preventing that side of the conflict, right? One of the roots of conflict is naturally going to be shaitan, right? And so by giving as much space as possible to your relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you lessen the amount of space that's available to shaitan to create that conflict. And so that's something that will also be very meaningful in relationships as well. So JazakAllah Khairan, I'm going to give the floor over to Sister Madiha. I apologize for going a few minutes over my time.
JazakAllah Khairan, thank you so much. A couple of the panelists have raised their hand. The attendees. If you're an attendee and you have a question, you can go ahead and send that in the chat, inshallah. We will try to get to that towards the end of our presentation. Sister Madiha, go ahead.
All right. JazakAllah Khair. I'd rather listen to Sister Sarah talk than talk about the stuff that I need to talk about. But what do we do when conflicts turn physical? Okay, when they become violent. I think one of the first questions we ask when we come to something like that is, can you save the marriage after something like this happens? So there are two situations, okay? If the conflict or if the violence was situational, that would mean that there was a conflict that was going on and things got out of hand and one partner, one spouse pushed the other or hit the other. But after that, they felt a lot of remorse. They were actually very apologetic. And when I say apologetic, I mean they apologized in a way where they took complete responsibility for what went down. Instead of saying, if you hadn't said this, I wouldn't have done this. If you hadn't done this, I wouldn't have pushed you. Instead, they say, it was all me, okay? Situational violence happens in both genders. The man could be the one who instigated it. The woman could be the one who instigated it. Whatever it is, the way to fix that is acknowledge that there was a problem. Also acknowledge that you probably have very poor conflict resolution skills, and then get professional help. So that means going to a counselor, talking to people in your community, people that who you know are community leaders who can help you through this. So that's situational violence. And also it's important to note that any kind of violence, whether it's situational or the other one that I'm going to be talking about, hitting somebody, pushing somebody in your family, these are all criminal behaviors and they come under family violence in Texas law. So let's be clear that it's not a small thing to push somebody or hit somebody or slap somebody in your household. Then we talk about something that's harder to talk about, which is characterological violence. anytime two people get together, when a couple is together, there's going to be power struggle. Okay, one person is always going to try to take power of the situation or be in control or decide things. That's normal. That happens. But if there is one person, and again, it could be the male or the female or the husband or the wife in our context, if they're trying to take complete charge, if they're trying to have complete power in their marriage, then that's a problem. Okay, what do I mean by power? Let's look at okay, what you see here is the Dalit model that we kind of defer to understand what power and control looks like. So this, if somebody is using any of these in any combination, we are talking about domestic abuse. If your partner, if your husband is trying to dominate you, is trying to control you, is trying to make you feel like you have no power, that's domestic abuse. They do that by financial abuse, not giving you money, not letting you work, and keeping a check on all the money that you spend. That's a problem, okay? If they're using isolation as a tactic, they're not letting you see your family, they're keeping tabs on all the friends that you have, they're going through your phone all the time, seeing who came, who you talked to, that's a problem. If they're threatening you, and sometimes in abuse, they will threaten you or the children or your family, and at times they will even say, I'm gonna hurt myself, or I'll commit suicide if you try to leave me, or I'll do this if you tell anybody this is going on. And after doing all of that, they will either minimize what they did or go in denial or accuse other people of their behavior, of why they did that. For instance, they'll say, you know, I hit you because that's what my dad used to do. So, okay, there is generational violence. It goes from one generation to the other. We know that. That could be an explanation for abuse, but it's never an excuse for it. So if this person continues to deny responsibility for what they're doing, even if they apologize afterwards, they don't take full responsibility, you know that's a problem. Most marriage counselors would not even consider working with you if they see this kind of violence is going on in the family, where one person is trying to take complete control, okay, is trying to run the marriage completely. I'm not an expert, and I don't need to tell you, but you know that this is not the kind of marriage Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wanted for you. This is not the idea of marriage in Islam. And it's just not normal behavior, it's pathological behavior. And it's important to call it that. So then the question comes, okay, I am in this relationship, what do I do? The answer, and I don't say this very lightly, is that you have to leave this relationship, okay? No amount of your attention, no amount of your love, no amount of your patience is going to change this person. This is not Beauty and the Beast. This is not fantasy, okay? This is real life. You cannot change this person. You're gonna have to leave. But I'll tell you what is real life and what is not fantasy is that women have left relationships like that. They continue to leave them and they get better lives afterward. If you read Surah Talaq, it talks about, you know, very important legal rules on how divorce should take place. But repeatedly in the Surah, Allah says that if you're worried about risk, I'll take care of you. Are you afraid of things? I'll take care of you. I will give you something better. Those promises. And I mean, if you actually read the Surah, it sounds kind of out of context that, okay, there are all these legal rulings, but then he's coming down to human level and saying, I know you're worried about these things, but I've got you. So before you even look at other resources, before you even look for community to help you, before you look in your families or friends, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is promising you that I've got you. I'm going to take care of you. So let's begin there, okay? And then there are so many resources available to you. You can call the National Domestic Violence Helpline. I'll give you resources in the end, inshallah. But you can call them. They can help you through that. If you don't feel safe with them, Daya Houston is another organization that helps women who are experiencing domestic violence. There's so many other organizations, and like I said, I'll share that information in the end with you, but there are resources for you to help you get out of this. Nobody wants it to end that way. None of us get married thinking that that's how our marriages are going to end. But the sad reality is that this is how it is, and that is why there is that fire exit for you. And also, I want to briefly talk about what the community can do if you know that somebody in the community is experiencing all of that. Okay, so don't wait for them to come to you. It is very hard for anybody to tell other people that I am being abused or I have been abused. Even a child will hide this from their classmates if their parents hit them or did something like that, if they violated them in any way. A child does not feel comfortable talking about it. So how is it comfortable for an adult woman or man to talk about it? Also, I just want to briefly mention that even though 85% of the time it's the woman who's being abused and the perpetrator is a man, the reverse can also take place in our communities, especially if there are vulnerability factors for a man, like, you know, his immigration status or his health or, you know, his financial situation. He could be on the receiving end of this abuse. And it's even harder for him to come and tell somebody that, look, this is what's going on. So yeah. If you know that somebody is being abused, or if you suspect something like that is going on without crossing their boundary, just let them know that you're there for them, okay? What happens sometimes is that even with our best intentions, we see a sister and we know that she's being abused, either, you know, it doesn't even have to be physical violence, but we can see things like she's always anxious about her husband, she's always anxious about things. I know with Muslim women, we're usually covered, so you can't see marks on the bodies, but maybe in the, you know, maybe when they're performing wudu or while you're praying with them, you notice something. Don't wait for them to come to you. Ask them, okay? And sometimes we say things like, well, why don't you just leave him? And if he's been this bad to you, why don't you just leave? Understand this about the woman. If she has been in an abusive relationship, her self-esteem is down below. It's right here, okay? And if you're talking to her from up here, why don't you take care of yourself? Why don't you think about your kids? Why don't you get out of this relationship? You are reinforcing the belief that she already has, that she's powerless, she's stupid, she doesn't know how to take care of herself, she can't do anything. So what do? How do you talk to this woman? You come down at her level, okay? And the most important term, honestly, of this century probably is validate. You validate what she tells you. If she tells you she's scared, you listen to that, you say, yes, that is really scary. That sounds really scary. If she says, I'm worried about my kids, I'm worried about if I leave him, he's gonna pursue me, he's gonna do this and that to me because he's used, you know, threats like that throughout their marriage, you validate that, you listen to that. Yes, this is very scary. Okay. What do you think we can do? Empower her, ask for her ideas first. If she sounds really helpless, it looks like she has no control right now. Okay, then you briefly give her some information. You know what? Call this counselor, maybe talk to them. Call this number, maybe they can help you. If it's financial struggle that she's going through, try and help her in that way. But don't talk down to her. And I know we have the best intentions, but what comes out and what she hears, there's a big gap between those two things. There was another thing I was going to say. Okay. And I also want to briefly talk to if by some miracle there's one of the perpetrators is listening to this. You're also my brother in Islam, and I want to let you know that there's help for you out there too. It may not happen in this relationship, but there are better interventions program across the US. There are some in Bryan College Station, there's some in Houston, and I'm going to give you, you know, their contact number also. You were not born this way. Something went wrong that you feel this need to control. But without honest acknowledgement, you cannot help yourself. You cannot change the situation. It will most likely not happen in this relationship, okay? yes, people change, yes, relationships change, but statistically, there is very little evidence that in this relationship where you have taken complete power and control over this woman, you will probably not change. It is probably best, and of course it depends on the situation, but it is probably the best for you two to part ways and get help separately. Yeah, I guess that's probably all that I have to say on that. And then we can, inshallah, open the floor for question and answers. Mariam.
Okay, thank you so much. That was really, both of you shared some very important information with us and lots of food for thought. There were a couple questions that were sent in advance. Inshallah, I'm going to go ahead and feel free to jump in, either of you, as far as our panelists. But I'll go ahead and direct the first question to Sister Madiha, since it's kind of related to what you were talking about. The first question that was sent in advance says that if your spouse constantly wants to text you and gets really upset if you don't text back immediately, how can you determine whether that is emotionally abusive or just an act done out of loneliness and jealousy? Is there a distinction between something that's emotionally abusive and just lonely and jealous?
Okay. One word of caution in anything is that we cannot give blanket statements on a person's behavior based on that sample of behavior. Okay, so if this is the only behavior we are seeing in this person, we need to explore, why is he doing that? Maybe she can start talking to him. If it feels like we're not getting results by our communication, then it's time to bring in some professional help and find out. But you cannot, so we don't want to create a hysteria in the community that, okay, if the guy is constantly checking your phone and that's the only behavior that we are seeing in him, that's abuse in any way, okay? Trust your instinct also on that. Are you seeing other things in combination with this, or is it just this one thing that needs to be explored? So let's give him a chance and find out what is going on with him. That's my take on it.
Thank you. Sister Sarah, do you have anything on that question, or would you like us to go ahead to the next one?
I thought that Sister Madiha's answer is excellent, mashallah. I think it's really important to take in the full context, right? Like we were talking about people's different triggers, right? If this is a particular trigger where okay, there's some sort of discomfort that comes for, if somebody's constantly texting you, is there something in this person's history where they've had issues with safety in the past, right? Where they couldn't reach somebody in their life and something bad really ended up happening, right? If there's a history like that, you understand why it's happening. Now, if it gets to an extreme point, like one of the things that I think is sometimes confused a little bit Islamically is the idea of jealousy in a relationship called ghira, right? And there is like a beneficial type of protective jealousy that comes in a relationship, and we all have that. Somebody that we love and care for, we don't want somebody to disrespect them. We, this is why when an affair happens in a marriage, it's so hurtful, right? Because there's a natural jealousy that is that's within a relationship. But when that becomes extreme, right? Like the Prophet ﷺ says that that among like protective jealousy is the kind that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala loves and the kind that he hates. And the one that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala loves is the jealousy when there's probable cause. And then the one that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala hates is the jealousy when there is no probable cause. Meaning that, if you're just checking, if you're constantly texting your spouse because you think that they're having an affair, right? Or they're talking to somebody you don't want them to talk to, and there is no evidence to show that, that's something that really does need to be explored, and you need to kind of figure out where that's coming from. But if there is some sort of, probable cause, like, okay, your spouse is going into a little bit of a tough neighborhood, or is going into, visiting a place that they've never visited before, and so you're constantly checking in to make sure that they're safe, that's really different, right? And so the Rasul Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam really distinguishes between those two things.
Thank you. All right, our next question, Sister Sarah, you can start with this one. What if one of the partners does not want to go to marriage counseling, and they say that they don't need a stranger to tell them what's wrong with their marriage? What advice would you have to, a couple in this situation?
So that's an issue that often comes up. it's not across the board, but the vast majority of times, usually the wife is seeking marriage counseling and the husband is struggling to kind of imagine how this could be helpful. Although I've also seen the opposite happen as well. But in general, the thing that I would say is if your spouse is not at the point where they can see the benefits that could come from marriage counseling, you forcing them to come into the room isn't going to get them to see that benefit. A person isn't going to change unless they're at the point where they want to change. No matter, it's like the same thing as when parents bring their teens in for counseling and they're completely resistant and they just don't want it. If they don't want it, nothing is going to change. That change has to come from within, right? Like Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us that he won't change the condition of a people until they change what is within themselves, right? So when somebody is, thinking marriage counseling could be beneficial, what I would say is go into individual counseling on your own, right? Explore what's happening in your marriage and ways that maybe you can deal with it. One-sided change can oftentimes lead to two-sided changes, right? Not all the time, but sometimes. And taking some sort of step is often more beneficial than taking no step at all.
Thank you. Sister Madiha?
Yeah, that's exactly what I was going to say, that you go for individual counseling and see if there's benefit for you, and then your spouse will also see some benefits. But also, I've also noticed sometimes women generally tend to start using that as a weapon, that, oh, we can't fix our marriage because, see, I talked to you about, couples counseling and you said no, so oops, we're done. Until you come to that, we can't fix it. Another thing you can try is identify one thing in your marriage that you want to work on. And so you introduce that idea to your partner as, you know what, I think we have it great, but it's whenever we talk about money, we get into this, feud. So maybe we should talk to a counselor about that. If you bring it up like that, maybe they wouldn't feel so threatened. So that's one thing to try.
Thank you. All right, next question. We had a participant say, I often see posts on Instagram about if you're experienced this, and that, you may be in an abusive relationship. Is determining if a relationship is abusive always clear cut, or can there be certain other reasons for someone to act in a certain way? So for example, controlling how you dress, having to ask permission to leave the house, not being allowed to work, are these things what could fall under what it means to be a wife in Islam, to please your husband's wishes? And could that actually be better for you in your spirituality? Sister Madiha, why don't you start with this one?
This is a hard question to answer because of so many factors. But I think the number one thing to trust is really your instinct. You can sometimes tell if this is somebody who's trying to protect me and take care of me, or somebody who's trying to control me and wants to exert their power on me. And I'm going to defer back to the reel that I showed before. Go through that maybe and look through that. So if it's about the way you dress, for instance, okay, what is the positive need that your spouse is expressing when he asks you for that? When I say positive need, positive needs are, there's a history behind everything that we ask. And Sister Sarah talked about that also. There's a story underneath every need that we have. So finding out where is this coming from could perhaps be beneficial. And I think Sister Sarah can say some more on the Islamic perspective of that. I feel she's more equipped for that.
Go ahead, Sister Sarah. Let's hear it.
I would not say that, Sister Madiha, but JazakAllah Khairan. I'm very good at Googling a hadith that have applicability and everything, alhamdulillah. But, I will say, I think that your points are excellent, mashallah. I will say that, again, like you said, in answer to the first question, you want to look at the big picture, right? Overall, how are you feeling in your relationship? Are you feeling trapped, right? Are you feeling suffocated? Are you feeling like you're being isolated from your circle, from your family, from your supporters, from people who can be a source of goodness in your life? Mm-hmm. For example, a spouse who is constantly saying, no, you're not allowed to visit your family, right? you can't go out with those friends. You can't, they come home and they're upset that you're on the phone with a friend or with your sister. Those are all, I would say, red flags, because it all contributes to the overall theme of isolation. And if you're feeling like, oh, I'm not allowed to go to school to get an education, I'm not allowed to go to work, I'm not allowed to make friends, that my entire world has to just be this one person, it's a dangerous place to be. So you want to see if there are a lot of other things that you are being restricted from that have that particular theme. And I agree with what Sister Madiha was saying with regards to focusing on your gut, right? What's your gut reaction when this is happening? But the one thing that I will just say is like a little bit of caution is, if you've had your own trauma, if you've had your own really, traumatic experiences, sometimes your gut will not be fully accurate. So you also need to reflect on your history. Have you come from a household with violence? Because if you've come from a household with violence, if you're in a household now, you're married to somebody who is starting to pick up on these abusive patterns, that's going to feel familiar. And even if it doesn't feel great, it feels normal. And a lot of times our gut can get confused if we have experienced a lot of traumatic incidents. And so you just want to pay attention to, well, is this healthy or is this familiar? Because sometimes they're not the same for everybody. So I would just, kind of caution about that. But I really agree, especially with what Sister Madiha was saying about the positive need. Understanding what's the intent behind why my spouse is requesting this, and trying to figure that out and having conversations about it.
Thank you. We had an interesting question come in with somebody who is with us in the program, one of our attendees. So I'm going to go ahead and read that and see if you would like to respond to this. Question is, how do you deal with a spouse who plays mind games, like waking you up multiple times in the middle of the night and then saying you're waking up because you're possessed and things of that nature? Sister Madiha, thoughts on this?
Okay, so sometimes that's like a textbook example of psychotic behavior, honestly. If somebody's waking you up in the middle of the night saying you're possessed, that person needs help. And I think we use this term so casually, you need help, but sometimes people need to know what help looks like. If this is psychotic behavior, the person will need to see a psychiatrist, probably be put on medicines to help with that. And I would advise that this sister helps her husband, or if it's the reverse situation, I don't remember what the question, was it the wife asking for her husband or the husband asking for her? Either way, whoever is doing the waking, they need to see a doctor. Okay. Yeah.
I would also agree with what Sister Madiha is saying. It's definitely a sign that there could be something serious going on, and it could be exacerbated, right? These things can get worse if they're not treated. The other thing I would also suggest is, are there other things that are happening, where, is this, because one of the things that's going to distinguish this from whether it's psychotic or abusive behavior is going to be if it's happening in other contexts as well, right? In an abusive situation, this would be a way of getting the spouse, like, if you're sleep deprived, you're not fully functioning, and this could be a form of gaslighting, trying to make them think that they're crazy, and things like that. And so if there are other things that are happening that are, it's very clear that this person is in their right mind as they're doing this, then that's also a really big issue to be aware of. But I would definitely explore the psychiatrist route first, because it's definitely concerning.
Thank you. A couple other questions that are coming in from our folks that are listening. We have one. This was also related to a question that somebody sent in advance. The question sent in advance was that there's a family where they have in-laws who live with the family. And the person said that one of the spouses wants the mother-in-law to come everywhere, whether it's, anywhere out in town or if they're going out of town. And the spouse whose in-law it's not, or whose mom it's not, says that I guess the wife feels like the husband wants his mother to come everywhere with them, and she would like some privacy, and she can't have certain conversations in front of her mother-in-law. How can she resolve this? The question from the audience was that, do you have any tips in general dealing with multi-generational homes and in-laws? So Sister Sarah, why don't you go ahead and start with this question?
Sure, inshallah. It's definitely, in-law situations are always, they can always be a little bit sensitive, right? There's so many different needs, so many different personalities, so many different dynamics that you're trying to navigate. And it can be very difficult, especially because Islamically, there's such an emphasis on good treatment of parents, right? But one of the things to always keep in mind is that good treatment doesn't necessitate abandoning the rights of others, right? And so I do think that one of the things that is not emphasized in the Muslim community that really does need to be is the idea of boundaries. It is really important. And when I say boundaries, it has a certain context, like you go on Instagram and people talk about asserting your boundaries where, you just like tell people off and you say, this is my time. This is and you cut people out of your life. That's not at all what I mean, right? When I say boundaries, I mean boundaries with the intent. We mentioned the hadith where the Prophet ﷺ says that better than prayer, fasting, and charity is putting things right in between people. And a lot of times what we do is we don't establish boundaries because we're afraid that it's going to ruin a relationship. But what happens when we don't establish boundaries? The relationship is ruined, right? Because resentment is built up. We feel overwhelmed. No privacy, like in this situation, right? In-law relationships especially, they're very sensitive. And so boundaries need to be established in order to maintain the goodwill between family members, right? Even in the Quran, like the Prophet, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us that when you go to somebody's door, knock, and if they don't answer, leave, it's better for you, right? That's a boundary. It's a privacy boundary, right? When we are told that we have to pray at certain times, we are creating a boundary around our time because boundaries are our values put into action. And if we value something, we create an action around it to preserve it and to protect it. If your relationship with your parents is important, you prioritize them. If your relationship with your spouse is important, you prioritize them. If the relationship between your spouse and your parents is important, you help them to prioritize that by setting healthy boundaries. If your wife needs a little bit of distance, a little bit of private time, that is fine, right? That doesn't mean that she dislikes your mom. That means that she just needs some time alone with her spouse, which is completely reasonable. It's not an unreasonable expectation. So having a conversation around what are some things we can do on our own, right? That would be, what are some times every week that we can spend just one-on-one? And what are some things that we can specially do with your mom so that we make sure that she feels included and that she feels loved and appreciated as well, right? So that both needs are getting met in that situation.
Thank you. We do have a number of questions and a little bit of time, so we're going to move on to the next one. Sister Madiha, there's one. It says, what if the spouse completely denies going to the doctor, even if they're exhibiting some signs of psychosis? And I guess there's a couple different cases where you mentioned that certain times people need help. And so what if one of the people is denying getting any help?
I mean, that would just apply to if they're refusing help for any other health issue also. What do you do? If they have high blood pressure, but they refuse to see a doctor, what do you do? So especially with psychosis, they're so disconnected from reality that sometimes they can't tell what is good for them and what isn't. So, I mean, it's very hard because I don't know the entire situation and I don't know the support system available to this sister or this brother. But sometimes at times like these, you involve the community. Okay, you ask somebody older in the community to kind of talk to this person maybe and make them see a doctor. Yeah.
Thank you. Another question is, what are some tips to keep mentally well personally, especially if you're unable to leave the house during this time of quarantine and it's causing some more conflicts at home? Sister Sarah?
So that's a a great question. If anybody in the audience has, no, I'm just kidding. But I think everybody is struggling with everybody being at home. And I think as long as we can realize that the situation is difficult, and have some compassion on ourselves for the fact that we're not going to be functioning at our normal capacity, there is going to be a little bit more impatience, a little bit more snappiness, right? These are all stress responses, and it's understandable. Now, the idea of self-care, right, is going to be really important. And when I say self-care, I don't mean bubble baths and chocolate and things like that. What I mean is creating a life in this daily routine that you can wake up to and not dread. That's what self-care is, right? Creating a life you don't feel like you need to run away from or escape from constantly. And so that would look, like we mentioned, boundaries. That's what that's what's really needed, is having specific times dedicated for work, specific times dedicated for family, specific spaces dedicated, especially if you're living with multiple family members. If you need space, if you have to go out into your car that's your alone space, whatever is needed in order to designate that. And having some sort of loose routine is also very helpful. Getting into nature for at least 10 minutes a day is one of proven ways to reduce some anxiety and depressive symptoms. Reading Quran, listening to Quran, and allowing that to kind of penetrate your mind and penetrate your heart can be very, very soothing, especially if you really are trying to focus on the sound and the meaning of it. It can function as a mindfulness technique where you're bringing yourself into the present moment rather than focusing in on all the what ifs that you're worried might happen. It's just very general tips, right? But it's a hard time. And I'm sure Sister Madi has some other thoughts that she can share about that.
No, I think self-care is extremely important, and self-care means different to other people. If you're into crafts, go do that. It's okay if you want to binge watch Netflix too once in a while. If that's part of your self-care, do it without guilt, okay? But yeah. I also wanted to share because we're kind of out of time, the resources. Hang on, maybe I can share my screen. Okay, so there's battering intervention, the BIP program in Brazos Valley. And I think Sakina Center in Houston is also a very good resource for women to have. DAYA is also in Houston. That's also a domestic violence hotline. These hotlines are sometimes very safe. If you call them, they're completely confidential. So if there's a sister out there who feels they need to reach out, I think these are good resources to have. Perfect. If you're feeling not very safe, they will also guide you how you can leave in a safe manner, because that's an important consideration in this case. So yeah.
Thank you so much. We can keep that on the screen if you wouldn't mind. And then the last couple questions, we had some folks asking questions about how they can connect with either of you, or I guess Sister Madiha, if you wanted to share those resources on the screen again, okay, just so we can have those up. Do you have any other recommendations for resources for either newlywed couples or just Muslim couples who may not be, they may not be struggling necessarily, but they just want to have a good, healthy relationship? Any books or anything like that that you have to recommend?
I've seen a very good trend recently in Muslim couples. If you are seeking counseling, the best thing really would be just to go on psychology.com, and then you can search for a counselor of your choice with filters depending on your insurance. If there's a language preference, there are lots of Muslim counselors too out there. So I think if you go through that, I think we're kind of confused about what counseling look like. It doesn't have to be a commitment for months. It could just be a couple of sessions to help you overcome some issues that you're going through. So yeah.
Thank you. Sister Sarah, do you have any suggestions of any additional resources, or if somebody was interested in contacting you or Sister Madiha, I guess you guys have any thoughts on that?
So there's also a great website if you are looking for a Muslim therapist. It's on SEMA's website. It's SEMA mental health, like / find a therapist. Like if you type in SEMA find a therapist, you'll find a list of, you can find local Muslim mental health counselors, and also muslimmentalhealth.com. Sister Romana here in the chat was also suggesting Olive Branch Muslim Family Services in Houston as a good resource for domestic violence issues. With regards to the resources for people who are not really having conflict, but just want to improve their relationship or prevent conflict, there are a few books that I think are really good. One is if you're looking to get married, Before You Tie the Knot, is written by a really wonderful therapist, Salma Abu Ghadiri and Imam Muhammad Majid. Really great book and a good resource. The Gottman books are great. The 7 Principles for Making Marriage Work is excellent. Before You Have a Child, they have another one, which is a follow-up, and Baby Makes 3, which helps you navigate your relationship along with a new child. There's also books by Sue Johnson, who is great. She has emotionally focused couples therapy, which is also a great theory for couples therapy, and she has a few books, Sue Johnson, so those are good. And then also, if you go on the Gottman website, I think it's www.gottman.com or something like that, there's something that you can sign up for where they send, it's called the Marriage Minute, and every week, once or twice a week, they send a very short email with just a tip that you can implement in your marriage that moment to help to build a healthy marriage, to address conflict in healthy ways. So I really recommend that. It's just really easy to digest and to implement right away in your marriage. So it's a great resource.
JazakAllah Khair to you both. Thank you so much. I think we all benefited a lot from everything that you shared. And we pray that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala blesses us all with healthy relationships and the ability to bring people together. Inshallah, for those of you who joined us tonight, or if you missed out, I will have a recording of this on our YouTube, as well as we'll post some resources on Facebook. We actually have another program coming up on October 23rd. And so if you enjoyed the talk today and would like to continue, October 23rd, inshallah, at 7:30 p.m. we will have Ustad Mahad Qamar and Ustada Safiya Rawat. They're co-founders of an institute called Sohba, and they will be talking about a prophetic marriage. And so inshallah, we have that as well. Jazakallah khair, everybody, for joining us, and inshallah, we hope to see you again soon at some future programs. Take care. Assalamu alaikum.
JazakAllah Khairan wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah.